Okay, so you impulsively bought a camera or you just got one as a gift, but seeing that big M for manual on the dial is intimidating? Don't panic. Going from auto to manual settings is not as tricky as it may seem. And if you haven't watched my first episode of this series on beginner photography, click up here somewhere to take a refresher on what is photography from styles, composition, and more. So now that you have your camera in that pesky little M mode, we need to talk about the exposure triangle. Now this is the magical formula that gives you a perfectly exposed image when you use your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO correctly. All of these settings will affect both the amount of light that you have in your image and the way that the final image looks, so you can mix and match them to create your desired photo. And if you make it all the way through to the end of the video, there's a fun little exposure cheat code, but only if you wait and watch until the end. Promise? Anyways, back to what I was saying about the triangle. So the first point of the triangle is aperture. Aperture is the size of the opening of your lens and is also measured by f-stops. A smaller f-stop number equals a larger aperture size, which also means more light is being allowed into the camera sensor. But how does this affect the final image? Aperture also controls your depth of field, aka how much of your image is in focus. If you want a nice blurry background, you'll want to opt for a lens with a large aperture like an f2 or wider. And when I say wider, I also mean a smaller number. I know this can be confusing. Or maybe you want to have a deeper depth of field. You'll want to close down your aperture to anywhere between f8 to f22. Just keep adjusting it until you have your desired depth of field. Moving on to our second point of the triangle, shutter speed. Shutter speed is the length of time that your shutter stays open, which allows for more or less light to hit the sensor. It also determines how you capture motion in your image. An image with a fast shutter, like say 1/2000th of a second, will generally be tack-sharp, where an image that keeps the shutter open for a full second will have motion blur if you're not using a tripod. If you're looking to photograph a moving subject, you'll want to use a faster shutter speed to freeze that motion, like say a 1/400 or even faster. But if you want a soft waterfall photo, then a slower shutter speed is best, like 1/30 or even slower. And our last point, ISO. Now historically, ISO was used to determine the analog film speed that someone was shooting at, but now it's really a way to measure the light sensitivity of your camera sensor. The higher the ISO number, the more sensitive it will be, making an overall brighter image. The drawback here is that when you crank your ISO incredibly high, it will also introduce digital noise, aka grain, in your image that you'll specifically notice in the midtones and the shadows. The amount of noise that you have will greatly vary between camera models and brands, but most photographers' rule of thumb is keep the ISO as low as possible while still having a well-lit image. Okay, so lecture time is over. Time for a quick demo on how to put all of those pieces together. So the first thing that we're going to be demoing is going to be the shutter speed of the exposure triangle. So we are here on the High Line and we've got a bunch of cars and people and bikes and everything moving really fast. So we're going to talk about how we would freeze that motion. So like I mentioned before, if you want to have something be tack sharp, you're going to want to use a higher shutter speed. It's about sunset, so it's a little dark, but we still have a fair amount of sunlight. We're at 1/250th of a second. The f-stop is 3.2 and our ISO is 100, and it's a well-exposed image. And when I look back here, it looks like our cars are tack sharp. Now, if you wanted to have these cars be really blurry and really show that slow shutter speed, let's do that from here, from this exposure. So if you want to slow things down, you need a really long shutter speed. So we're at 1/250th of a second. We're gonna drop that all the way down to a half a second. So now you can see it is completely blown out. So we're gonna go from there to try and fix that exposure. So we're gonna bring up that f-stop. Let's see as far as we can go. We're at f22. It looks a little bit bright. I'm actually gonna do this on a self-timer. If you're doing a long exposure image and you don't want to have any sort of camera shake, especially if you're using a monopod, but even if you're using a tripod with a longer lens, use that self-timer function so you can eliminate any of that camera shake. So with the half a second exposure, there is a fair amount of lens blur here, but say you wanted it to be even more blurry, or maybe you're shooting in the middle of the day where it's really bright out and you aren't able to crank up, and you aren't able to slow down that shutter speed enough to get the blur, then you could possibly add in a tool like an ND filter. So I'm gonna add that on here just to show you how that might work in real time. And then how do we do this? All right, so now we have an ND filter on. I think this is now at 5 stops. We're able to shoot let's go with a 6-second exposure now with the same settings. I think we're gonna get a nice bit of cars coming by. Let's check that out. See, now pretty much all of the cars have been entirely blurred out, as well as the people. So I'm actually gonna bring this, we're gonna do happy medium in between those two. Bring up the shutter a little bit. Let's do a 2-second exposure. The cars just like sit there. All right, we got a green light. So we're timing it, and now all the cars are gonna take off. Beautiful. So yeah, now we have a few different options for shutter speed and that blur. So you can have crazy blur, you can have a kind of a happy medium, or just a little bit of blur. So with shutter speed, you can kind of really tell a creative story with the type of shutter speed that you're using. Say you're shooting sports and you wanted to have all of the players be tack-sharp. Yes, you're gonna wanna have a higher shutter speed, probably even higher than 1/250. But if you wanted to tell a different story, really showing those movements, you can really slow down that shutter speed and show a more creative storytelling vibe to that photo. So now we're gonna be talking about how to use aperture in your exposure triangle with a portrait session as our example here. So as I was saying earlier, a wider aperture, AKA a smaller number, will allow more light into your photo while also giving you a more shallow depth of field. So if you were gonna be taking a portrait, you might wanna utilize that wider aperture. So we're gonna demonstrate this here with Sydney. So first of all, we have it on f5.6, and I'm gonna want a much blurrier background. So I'm gonna drop that all the way down to f2, which is the widest that this lens will go. And as you can see, it's really bright. So there are a few different things that we can do to make this a correctly exposed image when talking about that triangle. The first thing that we can do is drop our ISO. It was already at 500, which was pretty low, but we're gonna drop it down to 100. And now it's actually quite a bit dark. So I'm gonna bring down the shutter a little bit. And as you can see, the background is a little bit bright, but he is correctly exposed. So I'm actually gonna just shift over here a little bit. And this is actually a nice framing as well. So that background is nice and blurry. And it's also a well-exposed image. So if you were going from here and you wanted to say have the background fully in focus, you wanted to have a larger depth of field. Now from this exposure here, 1/250, f2, and then ISO 100, I'm gonna bring that f-stop really high up to say f11, just to go crazy. Now you can see it is really dark. We're gonna want to obviously change our exposure to fix this. So I'm gonna drop that shutter speed just down to, let's do 1/125, just to make sure we don't have any blur. We've gotten a little bit better, but we still need some more light. So I'm gonna bump up the ISO. Let's try 1000. That's giving us a much better exposed image. And now you can see he is correctly exposed, but we have all of the buildings a little bit more in focus. They're not exactly in focus, but they're much more in focus than they were before. So if you were doing something like an environmental portrait where you wanted the backdrop to be just as part of the image as your subject, you're gonna wanna use a smaller aperture size, but a larger number. So the last thing that I usually change in the exposure triangle is the ISO. And like I was saying, it's gonna be changing the sensitivity of your sensor of your camera. So a lower ISO will give you a darker image, but a cleaner image, versus a high ISO, which will give you a much brighter image, but you're also introducing a lot of noise to that image. So right now we're shooting at sunset. It's really bright out, so we're able to keep that ISO pretty low. So if I'm taking a picture of this building here, it's really bright. We're at 400 ISO. I'm actually gonna drop that all the way down to 100 just because we can. And you can see here, it's still a pretty well exposed image, even at 1/400th of a second, and our aperture is f2.8. Now, if you are someone like, I don't know, a bird photographer who's shooting in the early mornings, who needs to utilize a high shutter speed in order to capture birds in flight, then you might need to utilize a higher ISO to be able to maintain those fast shutter speeds. So it's kind of a give and take. I usually like to change that last so I can try and keep the ISO as low as possible, but sometimes you just can't really help it. You're gonna need to bump it up in order to get a properly exposed image, but it is still an integral part of the whole exposure triangle. So welcome back, and as promised, there is also a cheat code that can help when you're just starting out, and if you just skip to this part, I see you. We're gonna be talking about the Sunny 16 rule. Now this was really popular when shooting with film cameras without a light meter, but it can also be super helpful for fast-paced shooting scenarios like street photography on a really sunny day when you just need to set it and forget it. So you'd first set your aperture to f16 and you'd pick an ISO. We'll start with, say, 400. And then you'd set your shutter speed to be 1 over your ISO. So here we do 1 over 400th of a second. Now this should give you a properly exposed image on a sunny day, or at least get you most of the way there. And I recently found out that this rule also has a few sibling rules for other shooting conditions. You can adjust your aperture to f8 for overcast, f5.6 for heavy overcast, and f4 for sunset, and then you'd also follow the same formula that we did with f16. So now that you are an expert in manual exposure settings, you can use them to your advantage in order to tell a story in an unconventional way. If you're shooting a sports game, maybe you slow down your shutter to capture a bit of the player's movements rather than freezing every single action. Large apertures allow you to play with the focus by maybe putting things in the foreground, throw them out of focus, and help frame your subject. The world is really your oyster here, so I encourage you to take what you know now and experiment with all of the different avenues to create a well-exposed image. I'm Sam with B&H, and I'll see you next time.